Hey, welcome to the Strategic Success Podcast. I'm your host, Courtney. Thanks for tuning in. All right, it's here, you guys. The first workshop I have planned for 2025 will be on January 20th and 21st. As you know, I don't do group coaching. I don't do one-on-one coaching. I don't do consultations. I do a handful of workshops a year, and this is where I deep dive, open my brain, and dump it in a way that gives you as much information as well as some practical insight so you can, tackle whatever the topic is. So this class, it's my Fix Your Income workshop that is specifically geared for people who are already in the real estate industry, meaning title processors, real estate agents, appraisers, contractors, you name it. If you support or are part of the real estate industry, but if you have on your 2025 goals to start investing to do your first or next deal, this is the class for you. I am going to deep dive, what is a deal? Why should you invest in real estate? What is necessary to succeed in real estate investing? How do you find these deals? How do you fund them? Whether you have money today, whether you can qualify with a bank or not. I'm going to include things like sharing about creative financing and whatnot. And this class will be a 2-day deep dive. Lunch will be included both days, and a 100+ page manual will be included as well. This is going to be in the greater New Orleans area, in person only. Guys, tickets are $397 for folks who are in the real estate industry. Get your ticket today at CourtneyFricky.com. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Y'all, welcome to another episode of the Strategic Success Podcast. I am excited today to do a little bit of a recap. So for those of you who've been following along on my YouTube channel, I had this idea earlier in the year. Basically, I was pondering a really big thought. And so what I did is I pulled out my camera, pulled out a microphone, and during some of the conferences I attended, which I usually attend 6 to 10 a year, I started interviewing more experienced investors that I had the chance to get around. And I asked them all one question. By the way, this is something that I foresee myself doing as a trend every year, taking one question and asking folks repeatedly their thoughts on it to give you guys an idea of really people's philosophy and definitely experienced, folks who are smarter than myself. And so the question that I asked is, should rentals have debt or no debt? What should the goal be? Originally I kind of joked. I said, are you team, Ramsey, which is free and clear? Or are you team, Kiyosaki, which is leverage, leverage, leverage? Where do you fall? And so this has actually been a really good conversation that I've had with, at this point, I think 20 or so people from all over the country. And so I want you to hear today. I'm actually going to give you the Reader's Digest version of each of those videos. If you would like to go and listen to them further, these videos are anywhere from 5 to around 15 minutes a pop. So you could get through all of them in really not a long amount of time. And so, but this is really one of the overviews is I want to give is just kind of say, hey, these are some of the common trends I saw, some really good points that people brought up. But this question really was something I was focusing on because I have a very clear set of goals, which I believe that as I restructure my portfolio, I will really be done in just the next few years restructuring my portfolio. In the second phase, after restructuring, basically reacquiring properties, is then after that, I'm going to focus on the debt. Basically, I will stay active in the business and not retire, even though I could. I will focus on restructuring my debt. And so I've been thinking about my grand plan. I want to acquire a certain type of portfolio, which is what I'm focusing on right now. That's my phase 1. But then my phase 2 is then once I've acquired my ideal portfolio, then I'm going and restructuring my debt. So that is something that I am thinking through, like, hey, I'm a very strategic person, hence the name of this podcast. So then the question there is, should I have debt? Should I not have debt? And then really kind of just fleshing out basically the debt question with my ideal portfolio. So that's where this came from. Again, I wanted to pull in, a crowd of counsel from experienced folks. And I myself, being in the business for 10 years, there's a lot that I haven't experienced, and so that's what I wanted to draw on. So I'm going to go through these. Again, you can visit the videos. There's a whole entire playlist designated to this on debt or no debt on rentals. So let's jump into it. So Najee Barnes, my friend out of Houston, he made a great point. He's like, you should, have the debt that you're comfortable with. And this was actually a very frequent conversation among other folks, which was things like comfort level, the emotional side of it, the freedom and peace side. These are things you can't calculate. And it's basically people's risk tolerance, what allows people to sleep well at night. So all of this is stuff that I think you have to bring into account based on you personally. Many folks, not like Anaje, brought up black swan events. So we had things like, you know, for Anaje very specifically, it was Hurricane Harvey, and what that one event did to him and his portfolio. It basically he took a big hit from it. But other black swan events people brought up were things like COVID, the great financial crisis, and various things like that, where it's just unprecedented event that caused issues. So be mindful of that. Is those events, you want to think around debt not just when times are good, but also what would debt look like when, as Anaje said, when life is lifing. So, uh, Anaje believes that a debt is one of the most powerful tools in real estate. And this was actually a common trend here, is that many people saw leverage in debt as something that was a multiplier. And so I think that's very powerful. Anaje also said that it's hard to retire when you owe a lot of people money. I actually think that that's a very somber thought, is thinking about kind of pulling your foot off the gas, but yet having all this debt. Yes, your tenants are paying for it, but there's still a whole bunch of promises out there. So I definitely resonated with that statement. He said the whole debt conversation is really a cash flow conversation. And I think that's powerful, is because when you owe, it's the nature of, if the debt is good or bad, comes with, basically, is cash flow coming in. And so this is something that's important. Because, for example, and this is not something Anaje said, but for example, if you are not the best manager, you need to be mindful, like property manager, you need to be mindful, because having debt can be very difficult if you don't have consistent cash flow. He did make a note about hard money, hard money being of last resort. So not all debt is created equal, he explained, nor are all lenders. And more people should talk about debt. He made this point that most of the time the people talking about debt are the lenders who are selling the loan product. And so that it is important to have conversations around debt, and, the good and the bad, because as he explained, not many people talk about the deal that took them out, right? Because a lot of the people who were, taken out, they're no longer in the real estate game. They're not necessarily the ones sharing, right? So it's important to understand, in some of these other videos and their recaps, you're going to get to hear how the debt actually impacted them negatively, and I think that's important. One of the best pieces of advice that Anaje gave was very simple and very practical, but it was real, and people don't talk about this. He goes, you know what? You should be very mindful of debt if you can't pay your bills on time. Point blank. Like, if you can't pay your bills routinely on time, you should not consider debt, or you should be very careful considering debt. You should fix that basically lacking skill in your life of being on top of paying your bills. And a lot of that is basically management. It's money management. And so that money management skill is something that you should consider when considering debt. Again, people don't talk about this. Really practical. Anaje, I really enjoyed that conversation and how he brought that perspective. Another one is with Rich Lennon. So Rich Lennon, out of Virginia, he shared both as an investor and a lender. You know, he shared about how when he got further along on his the wealth, what he called the wealth curve, on his journey, that his opinion on debt has changed. And really for him, he went from very conservative to really seeing the debt for more of the tool that he is. For example, um, he went from having no debt to like seeing the no debt conversation as a scarcity mindset of almost like being very, very afraid. So you went to having no debt, you went to free and clear out of fear. And so for him, he had to deal with that scarcity mindset and then see how you could powerfully use leverage when it's used right. Um, he talked about the debt on his primary. At first, he went to having his primary free and clear, and then went back to leveraging it again. Again, seeing it as almost like a scarcity mindset with it. And then, he really emphasized that there needs to be a correlation between the amount of debt you have and, your where you're at. So, where you're at as an investor as well as your skill level. And I do think that there's a lot of truth to that because the more skill that you have, the more you can navigate when things get tough. Um, he really ultimately, one of the good pieces of the conversation with Rich that came up is what metrics do you care about? Those are some things that you should really isolate, think through, and figure out because, for example, he said that your return on equity, so how much money are you making cash flow wise comparative to the equity you have in that property? It's a conversation around debt equity, right? If you're only making $500 a month, but you've got 600,000 in equity, could you do better if you took that equity and went and bought, three properties worth 200,000, right? And how could you do with, it's that conversation, that metric. And he goes, return on equity decreases every single day because your equity grows, therefore your return on it decreases. And so you really have to figure out what metric matters to you, and then make decisions based off of that. And then, we did have a conversation on the conservation of capital, meaning at a certain point, you've got to ask yourself at what point do you start taking chips off the table? And that's a decision every investor has to make for themselves. Philip, Philip Klink, Philip Klink out of North Carolina. So, no, South Carolina. Sorry about that. Um, he is an exchanger, through and through. If you have not seen his podcast episode to explain exchanging, he is one of my favorite examples of an exchanger who's under 50 years old. Um, he brought up a really good point, and a few other people brought up this point, but not many. Which he said that a lot of people believe when it comes to debt or no debt that really a lot of people have the belief that the middle is actually safe, but Philip said it's actually not. He goes that when you have a lot of debt on a property, you and the bank have the same problem. When you don't have any debt on a property, you don't, you've got to handle that problem on your own. But when you have, let's just say a property's worth 100,000 and you have 50,000 in debt on it, it's really hard to access the rest of your equity. And so it's really hard to tap into your equity at that point. And so instead, he would rather that you have, instead of two properties that you have 50%, let's just say they're worth 100 and you have two properties with 50,000 on them each. He was like, I'd rather you get as much debt on one and then have the other one free and clear. Again, a few people made that same comment. I think is really powerful. And Phil was one of the first ones that really started to open my mind. Um, he also mentioned black swan events. You want to be mindful because your cash flow can be impacted, and then you have risk of loss at that point. Um, one of the things is he started bringing up something called a loan constant, and a handful of people brought up loan constants. And if you don't know what that is, I want to do an actual episode on this at some point to really break it down. But let me make this point that all the sophisticated investors that I respect in my life talk about loan constants. And a loan constant, which I have Philip explain it briefly, but again, I probably will do a more in-depth conversation about it at some point. Um, all of the most sophisticated investors in my life talk about loan constants. And so if you don't know what a loan constant is, this would be a really good one. The conversation I had with Philip for you to listen to. A few other people bring it up, and there's something to say about each of the folks who bring it up. So whenever he thinks about paying off his stuff, he doesn't think about paying off the one with the highest interest rate. He pays off the one with the highest loan constant first. And so he gives an example of, basically if it's 100,000 is what you owe left on the loan, but the monthly payment is 1,000, it feels like a higher rate, and because of the loan constant. Another thing is that so Philip is a very creative investor, myself included. And so us creative folks, a lot of people say, oh, you guys make the debt so complicated on creative financing. But a point that's really driven home with Philip in the conversation I had with him is that when in the creative world, we get to create our own debt. And then, so therefore, it becomes a lot of flexible terms versus an inflexible rate sheet that you get from an institution. And so that's just something kind of think about. In the creative world, you can really create your terms. And really in our world, everyone can become the bank. And so, sellers, other folks, things like that. All right. So Ellis San Jose out of California, SoCal area. Ellis, I really appreciate Ellis. By the way, a lot of the folks of the people that I had conversation with, their backgrounds are really impressive. Ellis being one of them. He's in a high cost of living market. He's just deals in kind of Los Angeles and that greater Los Angeles area. Um, he mentioned that having the wrong debt at the wrong time can combust. And so that's actually something we're seeing right now. Part of the reason I had this conversation is because, 2022, 23, 24, we've seen the impact of having the wrong debt. And so for him, one of the biggest metric that he cares about is peace of mind and lifestyle. So versus chasing all these other metrics like, your return on your equity, cash on cash return, all of that, he really says he's really sees himself in the middle. He still looks at those metrics, but those are the things that he kind of weighs out is that peace of mind and lifestyle. He also weighs out the metrics. He also mentioned the great financial crisis and in the changing market that he was able to survive a lot because of him being conservative and playing defense with the rentals that he had. And so that was actually something some other folks had mentioned is just you want to be mindful of when you're being very aggressive versus being conservative. And then one of the other thing is, he mentioned, he's very strategic when he adds debt, but one of the most important things he brought up is you should know what are in the loan docs because you want to be careful, especially with institutions, about some of the clauses in those loan documents. All right. So my friend Clark Horner out of Atlanta, Georgia. Clark is a businessman and an investor. And so he brought up some really distinct, he's an attorney as well. He brought up some very distinct concepts that I really appreciated. First of all, he said he loves lines of credits, business lines of credits, where, he's collateralizing his rental properties or collateralizing his free and clears so that he can still go out and buy properties and access basically his equity. Another thing is that he talked about a study of the ultra wealthy, that the ultra wealthy have the money to pay their debts, but they don't. But at the same time that they're careful to not over leverage as well. He said that there are studies that show the ultra wealthy keep between 40 to 65%. He brought up a term that I hadn't ever heard before, but it was a loan to portfolio or loan to their estate. So if you think about, there's the metric of loan to value. So if a property is worth 100, if you have a $70,000 loan on it, you have a 70% loan to value on that property. And that's something that in the debt world and the lending world is important, is what percentage are you leveraged? Well, one of the things he mentioned was this metric of loan to portfolio or loan to estate. And I think that's actually a very smart metric where it's, going 30,000 feet up and looking at the entire portfolio, which he actually says he treats like almost like a hygiene routine, where he reviews his portfolio, reviews the debt that he has, and is keeping an eye on it very routinely. In my podcast episode with him and his wife Lisa, one of the things they actually talked about is a routine they have within their marriage, is that they basically do bookkeeping for their personal finances so they can review things. Loved that about them. And so having him talk about how he reviews his portfolio and routinely assesses the debt on it, it will, and ultimately says that he said that it will help you steward it better, and it will expose options to you that you may have that you may not be aware of. So love that. Love how intentional he is. One of my favorites there. So another great friend, great thought leader in the real estate world is Coach Chad Carson out of Clemson. Um, so for him, he's really big on financial freedom, time freedom. I mean, he wrote the book Retire Early on Real Estate, with real estate with bigger pockets. So he has that. For him, he stated, is a really big, conversation when it comes to talking around debt is financial freedom and debt's role in it. So he talks about, basically right now he said he's at a point where he's financially free. So he's really in maintenance mode. And so he's trying to deleverage at this point, but he absolutely needed debt to get to that point, right? Um, so to ultimately, as someone who is financially free, he's now looking at less risk and more cash flow. So one of the things he's actually doing, I asked him strategically, how do you choose which properties to pay off? And he actually shared how he has a spreadsheet, and he looks at, one of the things is a loan constant. But he also said, what properties do I like, the least? The quality of the debt, again, the loan constants, the most dangerous and highest interest rates, and the highest payment. He looks at those metrics. And then what him and his business partner did is they created a separate bank account, and they have been putting money away into it. And so when they get a large chunk, they go and say, okay, well, hey, look, we have this 80,000 balance, but it's 1,000 a month. This one loan has an 80,000 balance, but the mortgage payment is 1,000 a month, so that's a really high, loan constant. Um, and so, hey, let's take that 80,000. And I mean, where could we go buy a property for 80,000 and cash, and basically cash flow 1,000? Because now that you don't have that payment, you still are, cash flowing. And really question, if I got a new deal, that would be new tenants. I mean, this is a property that he's already familiar with, has already renovated. He knows it. There's less risk without having to go get another property. He knows this one. He knows the tenants. And so for him, he understands that when it comes to the debt conversation, and with investing, that it's partially psychology and it's partially math. Hey guys, Courtney Fricky here. We've got Aussie Steve. And look, if you have a deal that needs to get moved, Southeast Louisiana, even in South Mississippi, we're your folks. We are the largest dispo company, really in the greater New Orleans area, even Southeast Louisiana. We have great contacts in South Mississippi as well. Steve, why do we move more deals than others?
Just we're very deep in this market, so Greater New Orleans can be really confusing for national wholesalers. The comps are hard. We change block for block. We got flood zones. We get a lot of hurricanes and the likes, and just a lot of the national platforms don't have the buyers on their list. So we are deep with buyers, but we're deep with relationships, which is really important in this market. So we love JVing with out-of-state investors.
Like I said, we do a ton of business with other investors. So go to homebuyerlouisiana.com/Courtney. Fill out the information, we'll get in touch with you, and we'll move this deal along. And so really knowing when to run the numbers, but also when to say, hey, will we sleep better having this paid off? So these are some of those things that I love these conversations from folks. Chad is a great one who breaks things down very easy to understand. Next one is Mr. David Tilney. He's both out of Colorado and in Florida. If you don't know who Dave Tilney is, I highly recommend. I can't wait to do a podcast episode with him. He's been in the business over 40 years. A lot of you loved this video with him. So, for him, when starting out, he mentioned that when you have nothing to lose, you should really use debt to your advantage and really try to max it out. But the caveat is it has to make sense. And then the other caveat is that basically your, as Leon Johnson later puts it, your tenants have to be able to afford it. And basically you have to be able to cash flow it. Um, you have to cash flow above the debt, what's required for that monthly payment. Um, he then says you got to get to a point where you would never want to start over again, and that's when it makes sense to start going to free and clear. Because so many folks, they never define, and I think this is important. David didn't talk about this, but a lot of people, they just go, and they never stop playing offense. And so therefore I think it's really important for people to define when's enough. And so, as David said, he says, when you get to a point that you'd never want to start over again, understand that with debt comes risk. And so there's a point that you'd want to go free and clear. And he actually said maybe go free and clear. And he mentioned during the great financial crisis that, a lot of people struggled to get out of title. They couldn't sell properties, they owed more than what it was worth. And so one of the number one things he is known for, David Tilney, he is known for, so his class, Hassle-Free Property Management, easily 2 or 3 of these binders are from his Hassle-Free Property Management class. Phenomenal. I think he only does it on Zoom now. But it's about landlording 101. It's a 3-day class, 2 days on landlording 101, but then the last class is on something called master leasing in the world of YouTube rental arbitrage. Well, so David is the king at this. He's been doing it for 40 plus years. And so a lot of his properties, he may not actually be on title. He's just renting them with the right to sublet them. And so for him, he talked about how a lease can basically provide the benefits of cash flow and things like that without all the risk of debt. And so, for example, he can do what's called a performance master lease, where hey, I will pay you, XYZ, and when the property rents. Well, if it doesn't rent, a payment's not due. That's really hard to get in the world with institutions and debt. And so, but ultimately, he believes the greatest thing in real estate is leverage. You can't do the same in the stock market. It is truly one of the things that sets things apart. And then, ultimately, he shared an example where he had a 35-year master lease, on a residential property, in essence, where he was able to control it, without using debt. It was really huge. Really, really huge. Loved that conversation with him. Next one of my top mentors, one of my top 3 mentors. By the way, I interviewed all 3 for this topic. One of them, John Schaub. He's out of Sarasota, Florida, been investing since the 70s. By the way, when I interviewed him, he's a really brief. This is one of my shortest interviews is with him because he's very simple and very brief. He had just had a tenant that had moved out of after 42 years. 42 years as a tenant. And he said he had a 20-year mortgage on that property when he had bought it. So that tenant paid twice over for the house by renting, in essence, right? Man, that's powerful. And so when he first started, all of his properties had debt. And so he made the distinction that when there is inflation, leverage is your friend. And so I think that was actually something I took to heart, that when there is, that debt really is your friend when inflation exists. And history has taught us that inflation has a lot of ebbs and flows, but it's a very big constant. Obviously, we're very familiar with it right now. One of the things he talked about was get rid of loans with that higher interest rates, but also the personal guarantee. Again, goes back to how Ellis talked about the clauses in those loans, it's important to understand what they say. Um, he mentioned ending up with the leverage that you want on houses you want to keep for a long time. So that's something to, ultimately keep in mind. Again, it's the quality of the debt that you have. Um, he mentioned, with multifamily, you have one, which he's done commercial and residential. He said with multifamily, it's one big loan, on one property. But when you have a whole bunch of houses, it's a whole bunch of different loans on different. So there is a level that you can spread out that risk. Um, he did mention how at times he went to interest only loans to lower his monthly payment. And then for him, he did feel that the best thing was some free and clear and some leveraged was better than just all leveraged. All right. Dina Jones Cox out of Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio area. She said that to leverage, leverage is growth. So at the end of the day, leverage does play, many people talked about how leverage plays a big role in growing. And so ultimately, some of the things that you want to keep in mind is what phase are you in? At some point, she said, by the way, she said, I'm not here yet, but at some point, let's pay some off, at that point, she's going to be less interested in acquiring and more interested in maximizing her cash flow on the properties that she currently has. So, some of the things she talked through is, how do you justify what to pay off? How do you, again, how do you start killing off debt at a certain point? Um, she said you've really got to think about those 0 to 2% loans, partnerships. That's where things start getting complicated. She did specifically say that there's a special place in hell for people who want to pay off 0%, loans. Even her heirs are instructed to not pay off the 0% interest loans. But ultimately, as a math equation, she said that debt is necessary to grow. But too much debt, everything is at risk. And we actually saw that a lot through some of those black swan events when people had too much debt. They put, even other properties at risk. She mentioned basically during the great financial crisis, when times got tough, her first debt priority was private loans with individuals, seller finance loans, and then subject to loans where it's tied to someone's credit. Those were her first priorities. Basically, hey, if I only received X amount of rent for the month, for whatever reason, those are the ones we're going to pay first. And then if you're juggling, and then after that, eventually get to the institutions. Because ultimately you've got sellers who are depending, on that monthly payment to eat, or, people, private money lenders, or sellers are depending on that payment to have good credit. The other thing she also mentioned loan constants and higher interest rates when you're thinking of paying them off. So again, I think I hope you're hearing one, some trends, and then two, some interesting points that people are bringing up. My friend Sam Wharf out of Tennessee, he's a silent professional that I'm going to keep trying to pull him in for some more, because he's one who's not going to jump in front of a camera willingly, but he obliged and shared with me. He mentioned that him and his wife have different views, which I think is actually, he was the only one who brought that up, which is so important. Like, what are you and your spouse's views on debt, and will that impact your decisions? That is important. So for him, he's very tax sensitive. So therefore, he has a lot of assets under his management. He has a large portfolio. Um, and so for him, ultimately, if he was debt free, he would struggle with some of his goals. And so another thing is, he mentioned, thanks to his wife, he was more conservative through the great financial crisis. Thanks to his wife, right? So they were, his loan to value to his portfolio was a little bit more conservative. But he suffered during that time due to low reserves. And he mentioned you don't have to have it liquid in cash, but you need to have it to where you can access it somehow. But these are things for like repairs and vacancies. And so he mentioned that was what ultimately caused him to really struggle was reserves. And he said, ultimately he's very pro debt if you know how to turn it into strategic debt. Basically, if you know how to use it. And we know a lot of people don't always know how to use it. Um, he will continue to buy for tax purposes. Again, he's tax sensitive. Like for example, you can run out of depreciation on properties. Again, he's been in this business for decades. So eventually you're going to run out of the ability to be able to write properties off. And so again, you may be still acquiring just for tax benefits. And lastly, he made a point here. He said, education will cost you. It's just much easier if you buy it. And cheaper if you buy it is actually how he said it. And I think that's important because all what we're trying to do here is just learn from other people's mistakes, right? And so he said education is he specifically said, let me reread it. Education will cost you. It's cheaper to buy it. I think that that's something has stand true for me. Bob Dressman out of Ohio, he shared as both an investor and a hard money lender. But he said during the GFC, he had a really hard time as an investor where he lost 300 to 400,000 a year for 3 years. Guys, if that's 900 to 1.2 million is something that he lost during the GFC. Not to mention, this is basically this is not accounting for everything with him, but basically he had a strategy that he was doing that was very aggressive and risky, and it ultimately bit him. And so then I said, well, how did you survive that? Because you're still here today, and a lot of people would have gotten taken out, having to pay out 300 to 400 a year just for 3 years just to overcome an issue. And he said he started up a business and he hustled, so that provided cash flow. But then the other thing was he had some free and clear properties he went out and leveraged to be able to make up for that basically those huge cash demands. Um, and he said that leverage helps when the market is going up, but it kills you when it's going down. And so he didn't mention this, but there's a quote by Jack Miller that I highly respect that said that the greatest risk to your portfolio or to a property is that monthly payment, especially when times are hard. And this really goes hand in hand with what Bob is saying here. And he said, you gotta be mindful of debt at different times, and at different amounts. And, at first, a lot of time and a lot of hustle, leverage really helped multiply that. As a lender, I asked him to speak on this topic as a lender, and he said, just remember that with debt, time is expensive. Specifically, he does a lot of hard money lending. And so just a reminder, especially when you have shorter term debt, that time is expensive. But even with a normal fixed debt that, oh, this property is sitting vacant, you're letting it go vacant another month, time is expensive. And lastly, he said, markets go up and markets go down, hustle through it. I know, Bob, that's easier said than done, but speaking like someone who's truly been there. Mike Russell out of Louisiana, my backyard. He said, free and clear, does it make sense? He really was actually asking this question, you can tell himself, and really talking through there is a burden of having cash and keeping it deployed. But then when cash is tied up and you have debt equity in a property, it's okay if you're financially independent at that point, but if you're still trying to build, it actually is really tough when you're trying to grow to have all your money stuck in a property. So, you just want to be mindful of that. And I think that's really fair. One of my first deals early on, I had paid cash for it and I did not make a plan on how to refinance it. And all my cash was stuck in a property. So I ended up having to flip it instead of keeping it as a rental, all because, again, all my money was stuck in there and I couldn't figure out how to refinance it. Eric Vogel out of Atlanta. By the way, if you watch the video, he has a t-shirt on that says Dave Ramsey doesn't know how to buy on terms. Cracked me up. I recognized his shirt in the middle of the interview. I started busting up laughing. He said the money always makes less in-house versus outside, meaning less of a return. And there's other factors like safety and security that you've got to keep in mind when talking about debt. He speaks very highly of being intentional. His podcast, the On Purpose Investor, like speaks obviously to that point. Ultimately, what might be right for one investor may not be right for the other, but getting intentional will help you answer this question. And so I love that Eric pointed that out. He also said, if you don't know where you're headed, you'll end up somewhere else. That is a Yogi Bear quote. He's talked about very specifically how he's been maneuvering his properties to get more intentional about the debt situation and his cash flow situation. Him and his wife are financially free on not a very large portfolio, so something to pay attention to. My number one mentor, Pete Fortunato, these videos I kind of aimed at a 5 to 7 minute video. Pete's the longest. I let him go for 15 minutes. Pete gave some fantastic advice here. So listen up. My number one mentor, Pete Fortunato, he said, when building and when growing, you need to use it. Again, very common theme. He said, if I would have waited to save enough money to buy my first property free and clear, he said, I'm 77. He started when he was fresh out of high school. He would still be, he'd still be saving today to do his first deal. He called debt promises. One of the number one things I love for him is how views debt as a promise and not just an obligation. And he said, today you have no option because of inflation. You have no option but to leverage. And so he is at 77 years old. He is using leverage to buy income producers that are inflation hedged because all of the inflation that not only are we facing, but we may continue to face because of government decisions that you cannot control. He then shares a case study. I want you to go listen to it specifically, but he talks about how he had one property that he leveraged and re-leveraged time and time again. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 different times he re-leveraged just one property since 1995. And what he does is he's very aggressive with his portfolio, but when, he does these refinances, ultimately, he uses leverage to take a position against inflation, but that doesn't mean go take the money from the refinance and go buy a car or a boat. You should go use it to buy more income producing properties. And so you should add cash flow and buy better houses. One time he did the refinance and he put new roofs and windows and air conditioners and he improved his properties. And looking back, he said, that was 2019. He said, I was being too conservative. I should have bought more properties instead with that. So that is one of the things I think it's really important that as he is aggressive with debt, he's using that to not let me just pull that money out and go willy-nilly with it, but let me use it to buy income properties. Love that from Pete. Danny and Ann Williams, surprisingly, was one of my favorite interviews with them, some of the conversations with them, but they're out of Georgia, right out of Atlanta, Georgia area. And they talked about having, the stages and your goals really should impact this decision for you. What stage are you at in your investing career and what are your goals? They like some free and clear and some leveraged. They mentioned that when you have a free and clear property, the metric of your rate of return is lower, but you've got to be mindful. They're the ones who mentioned that you either have a lot of debt or you have free and clear, that they don't like staying in that middle place. And so they were one of the other ones who brought that up. It's hard to escape when you're in that middle one. He said, be careful. Private lenders are flexible. Banks are less flexible. Again, that's a common thing among some of the folks that I hang out with. But you'll hear that there's some others who brought up bank financing as a positive. And Danny Williams mentioned Jack Miller. He said, Jack had a quote that said, have a strategy for every part of the cycle. So every part of the market cycle, the economic cycle, have a plan for it and have a strategy for it. And I'm reading through Jack Miller's newsletters from the Commonwealth newsletters, which you can get on cashflowdepot.com. I'm going through those. He started writing them in October of 1978, went all the way until 2009, when right before he passed away. And he shares about how he, as you know, I'm in the 80s, the mid 80s right now, and he shared on a monthly basis in these newsletters how when things were changing in the market, he would change his strategy. Something to think about. The next interview was with Leon Johnson. Leon Johnson out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, one of my main mentors, biggest influences, one of my top three. So you got John Schaub, Pete Fortunato, and Leon Johnson. So Leon's been a huge influence, but he has also been the one who introduced me to the people, the likes, pretty much the likes of all these folks, and then some. Um, but Leon, he said, you really have to define what freedom and peace looks like for you to be able to answer this question. It's really going to depend. He also mentioned that what he looks for is safe and feasible debt. He has some free and clear, but he likes to keep safe and feasible debt. So I asked him to define that. And, because he's like, I don't want to pay that off. And he said, if it doesn't have balloons, if it doesn't have a high interest rate, and that the tenants can easily afford it. And so those are some of the metrics he's looking at when he's looking at debt, safe and feasible. I asked him, what did he think about subject to? I was baiting him. I know his thoughts on this. And he said, basically subject to deals, the debt tied with a subject to deal is not safe and feasible, even though it may not have a balloon on it and may not have a high interest rate, and his tenants may easily be able to afford it. But he said there's a lot of risk. He said it's not safe and feasible debt, according to him. He mentioned this was one of the best things that I heard him bring up of all the interviews. This is one of my favorite things. He goes, a dollar today is worth more today than a dollar tomorrow. Basically, it's the idea that the dollar is losing value. It's the idea of real value versus nominal value. And it's worth a lot more. A dollar is worth a lot more today than it is 10 years down the road. So basically, this debt is you're getting the power of it today, and you're getting to pay it back with cheaper dollars tomorrow. That is the inflation hedged part to debt, is that basically you're getting the use of that money today, but then you're getting the ability to pay it back with cheaper dollars in the future. And so then he gives a leverage example. He goes, you can have one free and clear. Let's just say it's $100,000 house. Or you could have leveraged 10 houses with 10,000 down, and ultimately 10 $100,000 houses. So then you have $1 million portfolio. So the other thing is when you're looking at paying things off, Leon mentioned you should look at, if I'm going to pay this off, what is my opportunity cost to get a better return? Basically, be careful paying stuff off if you don't have a better opportunity to deploy that cash. And then he said, be careful using labor-based income to pay it off, meaning money from a W-2 job. He said, labor-based income from a job, a W-2, you have to earn $1.40 to pay back $1. So you want to be, because of taxes. And so you want to use investment-based income to buy rentals instead. So he said, be mindful basically where the source of that money comes from when you're thinking about paying stuff off. A little bit of semantics there, don't you think? Next one, my friend Jeff Watson, who's an attorney out of Ohio. He said he prefers free and clear for the freedom and peace part. That is basically higher leverage won't bring him that freedom and peace. And then he had a lot of free and clear that gave him flexibility during COVID, that he was able to help his tenants survive during that time. And then ultimately, when he uses other people's money, he thinks about the people just as much as he thinks about the money. I think that's important. When you're taking OPM, other people's money, to do a deal, you should really consider the person. My friend Al DiGirolamo, he is out of now from Philly, but now he's in Florida. He said, he mentioned using the cheaper dollars in the future to pay back a fixed loan. He likes that his tenants pay it, and then once he hits his goal, then he's looking at free and clear. And then lastly, I had the conversation with Jim Ingersoll. I love Jim. He's out of Richmond, Virginia, and he loves debt as leverage, and specifically real estate debt. He hates personal debt. Um, he's like, basically, most people have to use leverage or they can't get going. It's the idea that so many of us start with no money, to get going, right? Um, and so he really had admonished us and encouraged us to not let fear hold us back, the fear of debt to hold us back. And then he encouraged that we should become financing masters. And I asked him, what does that mean? And he said a financing master is learning how to use things like bank financing and structured deals and how to understand those. He specifically loved when you have a free and clear property. So that provides you with freedom and peace, but you can always refinance it. And when you refinance it, that money, that income is tax free. So if you have a $100,000 property worth 100,000 and they let you refinance 70 of it, that 70,000 is tax-free income. So Uncle Sam is not taxing you on it as if you earned it. So there's actually a lot of power in that. Another thing is that Jim said, be careful. He loves Pete, Leon, John Schaub, all those other guys. And he said, but be careful being allergic to bank financing. He said that's been something that's been very powerful, that like DSCR loans, stuff like that. And he said, financing unlocks the wealth building. And so specifically, he mentioned, be careful being allergic to bank financing, specifically with larger commercial properties. He shared about how, I think it was a 20 unit, a 32 unit that he bought on seller financing, but to keep bank financing in mind, because especially with those bigger deals. And he loves the idea of paying off his primary residence for the sake of freedom and peace. And again, that comes up where you have to define it. So let me give you my final thoughts. Ultimately, here is after interviewing all these folks, again, I started this off where I interviewed all these folks to really get an idea for myself of how did I want to view? I still think it's a forming thought, not a fully formed thought. But here are some of the final thoughts that I have. That the middle is not safe. So highly leveraged and low debt, that middle part is not the safest. And so that is actually something I think that has me thinking about action the most. I have a spreadsheet that I use that tracks my entire portfolio. And one of the things is it, routinely, I wouldn't say every quarter, but something like that. Every quarter, every other quarter, I go and I run comps on my properties and I update that in the spreadsheet. Based on these comps, this property is worth this. Well, then basically in the spreadsheet, I look at my collective debt on a property and I say, okay, what percentage of debt do I have on it? And I've got some properties that are starting to get down, under 60% loan to value on a property. And there's a level there that I'm wondering, should I do something with that? Should I take basically that low loan to value and should I go do something else with that? Just things that I'm thinking about here. Another big point here is just the thought of inflation. Because we're in such inflationary times here in 2025, and just there's still a lot we have to pay for because of the the government spending that hasn't really fully hit the market yet. There's still a lot of spending going on. Therefore, the belief is that inflation is here to stay for a while. It demands that you leverage. And so for me, that is actually drawing me to go buy more properties and to leverage them, but to leverage safely. Another part there is just revisiting that safe and feasible debt part, being very mindful. I buy a lot of properties subject to, but being very mindful, and then even knowing that, hey, what does it look like to restructure that subject to debt sooner rather than later, just to keep a more safe approach with my debt. Ultimately, reserves is something that I am, looking at and really trying to find what that means for me. I've had a very fluctuating goal or definition of what reserves should look like in my portfolio. So those are the things that I'm thinking of. And then ultimately, you know, really what I'm looking at is at a certain point, I'm going to look after I acquire the portfolio that I'm looking to acquire, and it's very defined. Then I'm going to look at paying off or restructuring based on the portfolio and the quality of my debt. And so I really appreciate the thought of, instead of just going all free and clear or keeping debt, it's some free and clear and some, still having debt, but that debt, the quality of that debt being safe and feasible and being mindful of that. And then lastly, I've really got to define freedom and peace for myself personally. And I think that that is something I would encourage all of you to do. Because I think a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on this topic, but I think it's really important to learn that when times got hard, again, debt was a two-sided sword. It helped a lot of people, but also hurt a lot of people. And so you've got to define your ability to handle um, the risk of debt, but then to learn how to use, as Sam said, a strategic debt. And then ultimately, one of the things Pete said that I didn't mention, he said, you can make foolish decisions with debt. And so you really want to be mindful with that. Learn from folks who've been, further down the road on this investing journey than you are, and continue to learn from them so you can make safe decisions. Guys, that's it for my recap of the 2024 question of the year, which is, should you have debt or no debt on your rentals? I want to hear, did you like this model of me asking a lot of people the same question? Because guess what? I'm doing it again in 2025. I have a completely different question. I'm not telling you just yet. Don't even bother asking. I'm going to release it at some point, and I've already started filming some videos of it, and I'm looking forward. Not only do I have my normal 6 to 10 conferences I'm going to a year, but some of them are actually new conferences for me to attend. So I'm going to be pulling it out, asking some big questions, some hard questions. Nonetheless, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Look, I'm cheering you on in 2025, and I am thankful for these conversations that I've had around a very important topic in the investing world. Take heed, go listen to the full videos in the playlist, and appreciate you guys tuning in. Have a great rest of your week. Appreciate you.